The official record tells us that modern hospital design emerged gradually through the 19th century, a natural progression driven by advances in medical understanding, sanitation theory, and urban growth. But between 1820 and 1860, across cities that had never communicated their architectural plans, hospital construction followed nearly identical spatial logic. Boston's Massachusetts General Hospital, completed in 1821, used a pavilion layout with cross-ventilation corridors that wouldn't align with germ theory for another 50 years. London's St. Thomas Hospital, rebuilt in 1871, replicated the same radial ward system, down to ceiling heights, window spacing, and the separation of administrative wings from patient care. These weren't coincidences. They were repetitions. And by 1875, almost all of them had been replaced. This is a documentary examining architectural timing, institutional coordination, and the physical evidence that remains in public records. It does not claim conspiracy. It presents observation. The timing alone creates friction. The first modern hospitals, those built with stone foundations, multi-story wards, and advanced heating systems, appeared in cities whose populations didn't justify them. In 1825, Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Hospital expanded to include wings designed for 400 patients. The city's recorded population that year was under 120,000, with fewer than 2,000 reported hospital admissions annually. The math doesn't resolve. Similar patterns emerged in Manchester, Liverpool, and Leeds. Each city constructed large medical complexes in the 1830s and 1840s, facilities with identical design language, despite being built by different architects under different municipal governments. The pavilion model was everywhere. Long, narrow wings extending from a central administrative core. High ceilings. Large windows in sets of 3. Ventilation shafts built into walls. Heating ducts running beneath stone floors. These were not experimental designs. They were replications of a standard. Consider the materials. The stone used in London's Guy's Hospital, completed in 1829, came from quarries in Portland, transported over 100 miles by canal and cart. The labor required to move that volume of dressed stone would have employed hundreds of workers for years. Yet records show construction completed in under 4 years, during a period when Britain's economy was strained by post-Napoleonic recovery. The same stone, the same time frame, the same layout. In Dublin, the Meath Hospital expanded in 1836 using granite blocks sourced from Wicklow. The expansion included underground utility channels, drainage systems angled for future plumbing, and structural supports rated for floors that were never built. It wasn't under-engineering. It was preparation for a system that hadn't arrived. Then there's the question of the records themselves. Most hospitals from this period maintain detailed construction logs, records of labor and timelines. But those records often begin mid-project. The Massachusetts General Hospital Archive includes expenses starting in 1818, but no documentation explaining why the Board of Trustees chose the pavilion layout, or who designed the ventilation schema. The plans existed. The reasoning didn't. In Edinburgh, the Royal Infirmary's 1870s rebuilding followed a design template that hospital administrators couldn't attribute to any known architect. Committee meeting notes reference the standard arrangement, but no prior standard is cited in city or national records. It's as if the knowledge was inherited, not invented. What makes this unsettling is the consistency. By 1850, hospitals in cities across the English-speaking world shared architectural features that had no medical justification at the time. Ceiling heights of 14 to 16 feet, later explained as necessary for air circulation, but built decades before miasma theory took hold. Ward widths of exactly 25 to 30 feet, matching the proportions needed for cross-ventilation, a concept formalized only in the 1860s. Separation of surgical and medical wings, logical under germ theory, inexplicable under humoral medicine. These features weren't adopted. They were assumed. And then, in a single generation, they were abandoned. Between 1870 and 1900, nearly every major hospital built before 1860 was either demolished, repurposed, or radically restructured. The pavilion model was replaced with compact vertical designs. Heating systems were rerouted. Ventilation shafts were sealed. The explanation given was modernization, that advances in medical science required updated infrastructure. But the original designs had already anticipated those advances. The 1871 rebuild of St. Thomas's Hospital introduced modern sanitation, yet the 1840 structure it replaced had drainage systems built to the exact specifications later recommended by Florence Nightingale. She didn't design those systems. She observed them, studied them, and formalized principles they already followed. In Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Hospital's original 1755 building was expanded in 1804 with wings that included ventilation features matching designs published in France in 1788. But there's no record of correspondence between the hospital's board and French architects. No evidence of imported plans. Just parallel execution. By the 1830s, this pattern had spread to cities with no formal architectural schools, no established medical colleges, and no documented communication with European institutions. Buffalo's Buffalo General Hospital, opened in 1858, used the same pavilion structure as hospitals in London and Boston. It included below-ground utility corridors designed for steam heating, installed 6 years before steam heating became standard in American hospitals. The infrastructure preceded the technology. What's preserved in city records isn't controversy. It's correspondence. Letters between hospital boards in the 1840s reference the usual configuration and standard practice, but never define what those standards were based on. Architectural journals from the period describe hospital construction as following established principles, without citing where those principles originated. It's a vocabulary of inheritance. And when those buildings were replaced, the new designs didn't improve on the old ones. They simplified them. Compact footprints. Reduced ceiling heights, smaller windows, centralized heating instead of distributed systems. Efficiency replaced capacity. The question isn't why hospitals were modernized. It's why they were built with capacity they didn't need, using design logic that hadn't been theorized yet, during a period when resources were limited and populations were smaller. The timing suggests something else was at work. The pattern wasn't limited to a few cities. By 1840, hospital construction across the United States and United Kingdom had synchronized in ways that municipal records don't explain. The designs weren't imported through documented channels. They appeared as assumptions, built into budgets, carved into stone, embedded in infrastructure that outlasted the institutions that commissioned it. And the scale was enormous. In New York, Bellevue Hospital's 1826 expansion included a heating system designed to serve a facility 3 times its actual size. The boiler room, still visible in architectural surveys from the 1880s, contained infrastructure rated for 1,200 beds. The hospital's recorded capacity in 1826 was 400. The excess wasn't a mistake. It was engineered. The same pattern repeated in Boston, where Massachusetts General Hospital's 1820s wings included utility shafts running vertically through 4 floors that weren't added until the 1850s. The shafts were built into the original foundation. Someone planned for expansion that wouldn't happen for decades. In Liverpool, the Royal Infirmary's 1832 construction included drainage channels angled to accommodate future plumbing connections that wouldn't be installed until the 1860s. When pressurized water systems became standard. The channels were already there, waiting. This wasn't isolated overbuilding. It was coordinated preparation. Consider the Erie Canal, completed in 1825. It's remembered as an infrastructure triumph, a waterway that connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, transforming commerce and settlement. But the canal's design included features that exceeded its immediate function. Locks were built wider than the boats in use. Aqueducts were reinforced to handle loads heavier than anything being transported at the time. Reservoirs were constructed with capacity far beyond the canal's operational needs. The official explanation is foresight, that planners anticipated future growth. But the growth didn't follow the infrastructure. The infrastructure preceded it. By the 1830s, towns along the canal's route had hospitals, courthouses, and administrative buildings that matched the scale of cities 10 times their size. Buffalo, with a population under 10,000 in 1830, had a hospital designed for 600 patients. Rochester's municipal water system, installed in 1834, served a grid built for 50,000 people. The population that year was 12,000. The mismatch is constant. Railroad construction followed the same logic. Between 1840 and 1860, rail networks in the United States expanded faster than demand justified. Lines were laid through regions with sparse populations, connecting towns that didn't yet exist. Stations were built in advance of settlement, stone structures with waiting halls, freight depots, and passenger platforms designed for traffic that wouldn't materialize for years. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's 1850s expansion into western Maryland included stations built to handle 2,000 passengers daily. Most served fewer than 200. In England, the Great Western Railway constructed terminals in towns like Swindon and Didcot, towns that became railway hubs only after the infrastructure was already in place. The stations weren't built to serve existing populations. The populations grew to fill the stations. The sequence reversed, and the architectural consistency remained. Railway stations across the UK and US followed nearly identical designs between 1840 and 1870. Vaulted ceilings, iron frame construction, platforms built in multiples of 6, ticket halls with ceiling heights of 20 to 25 feet. These weren't aesthetic choices. They were specifications. The same specifications appeared in post offices, custom houses, and municipal buildings. In 1858, the U.S. Treasury Department issued guidelines for federal building construction, guidelines that described design standards already in use for 30 years. The document formalized what was already uniform, but it didn't explain where the uniformity originated. The administrative coordination is what's most difficult to account for. In the 1840s, cities across the United States began adopting identical record-keeping systems for births, deaths, and land transactions. The formats weren't legislated. They emerged simultaneously in municipalities with no formal communication. Boston's 1844 Vital Records Registry uses the same column structure, page dimensions, and indexing system as Philadelphia's, created the same year. The handwriting differs. The format doesn't. By 1850, this system had spread to over 200 cities. The explanation given is bureaucratic efficiency, that effective systems naturally replicate. But these weren't gradual adoptions. They were synchronized implementations. Hospital intake records followed the same pattern. Between 1835 and 1855, admissions logs in hospitals from Baltimore to Manchester used identical categorization schemas. Patient name, age, occupation, diagnosis, ward assignment, discharge status. The language varied. The structure didn't. It's the consistency of inheritance, not invention. Then there's the question of the grids. Urban planning in the 19th century is credited to visionaries, planners who designed cities for future growth. But the grids built between 1820 and 1860 weren't projections. They were completions. Philadelphia's street grid, extended in the 1820s, included blocks laid out for a population of 500,000. The population in 1820 was 63,000. The grid didn't fill in gradually. It was surveyed, plotted, and recorded as if the city already existed at full scale. The same thing happened in Chicago. The 1833 plat map divides the city into a grid designed for 400,000 residents. The population that year was under 4,000. Streets were named. Parcels were numbered. Infrastructure was planned for a city that didn't yet exist. And when the population did grow, it followed the grid exactly. Water systems show the same anticipatory design. In 1842, New York City completed the Croton Aqueduct, a gravity-fed water system capable of delivering 90 million gallons per day. The city's population at the time required less than 30 million gallons. The excess capacity wasn't speculative. The infrastructure was built to serve a future that planners couldn't have predicted with accuracy. But they built it anyway. London's Thames Tunnel, completed in 1843, was designed as a transportation corridor, but its dimensions matched specifications for underground rail, a technology that wouldn't be implemented in London until 1863. The tunnel waited. Ready. This is where the term Tartaria enters the conversation, not as a historical claim, but as a label applied by observers trying to account for the consistency. The name refers to maps from the 18th and early 19th centuries that used Tartary to describe regions across Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. On those maps, Tartary wasn't a single empire. It was a geographical designation for areas outside European political control. But in recent years, the term has been repurposed. Modern researchers examining 19th century architecture have noted the uniformity of design, the overscaled infrastructure, and the synchronized administrative systems. Some have interpreted this as evidence of a prior civilization. one whose infrastructure was inherited rather than built. The hypothesis is that the buildings, grids, and systems attributed to 19th century construction were actually remnants of an earlier period, repurposed and relabeled. The evidence they cite is the evidence presented here: the timing, the scale, the preparation for systems that hadn't been theorized. Whether that interpretation holds depends on. The term Tartaria originates from European cartography, maps that labeled vast regions of Asia as Tartary or Grand Tartary. These weren't political boundaries. They were placeholders for territories that Europeans hadn't colonized or fully documented. By the early 1800s, the term had faded from use, but it resurfaced in the 2010s, applied not to geography but to architecture. Researchers examining 19th century infrastructure began using Tartaria as shorthand for a hypothesis that the buildings attributed to the 1800s weren't constructed during that period. They were inherited from an earlier civilization. The hypothesis rests on the observations presented in this documentary: the scale mismatches, the synchronized designs, the infrastructure built before the demand existed. Three interpretations have emerged. The first is inheritance. This interpretation suggests that much of the infrastructure attributed to 19th century construction, hospitals, rail stations, canal systems, municipal grids, was actually built earlier by a civilization whose records were lost, suppressed, or misattributed. Supporters of this view point to the uniformity of design, the over-engineered foundations, and the lack of documented architectural reasoning in city records. They argue that the 1800s represented a period of occupation and adaptation, not original construction. The evidence they cite includes the drainage systems that anticipated modern plumbing, the ventilation designs that preceded germ theory, and the administrative systems that appeared simultaneously across unconnected regions. This interpretation treats Tartaria as a label for that lost civilization. The second interpretation is convergence. This view argues that the uniformity reflects not inheritance but shared knowledge, transmitted through undocumented channels. Architects, engineers, and planners may have communicated informally, replicating successful designs without leaving formal records. Under this model, the overscaled infrastructure wasn't preparation for a mystery, it was aggressive speculation. Planners in the 1800s built for growth they believed was inevitable, using designs that spread through professional networks. The synchronized administrative systems in this view reflect bureaucratic efficiency. Effective models naturally replicate. This interpretation treats Tartaria as a misreading of normal historical processes. The third interpretation is coordination. This view suggests that the infrastructure was built as part of a deliberate, centrally planned effort, one that isn't fully reflected in surviving records. Governments, financial institutions, or private consortiums may have directed large-scale construction projects designed to shape future settlement patterns. Under this model, the Erie Canal, the rail networks, and the hospital systems weren't independent projects. They were components of a larger strategy to engineer urban growth. The evidence includes the identical record-keeping systems, the synchronized construction timelines, and the fact that infrastructure consistently preceded population growth by decades. This interpretation treats Tartaria as a metaphor for centralized planning that wasn't publicly documented. All three interpretations attempt to explain the same friction: the mismatch between the scale of 19th century infrastructure and the populations it allegedly served. None of them resolve the timing. Return to 1816. That year, often called the year without a summer, saw global climate disruption caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora. Across Europe and North America, temperatures dropped, crops failed, and populations migrated. But in the decade that followed, infrastructure construction accelerated. Hospitals expanded. Canals were completed. Rail lines were surveyed. Administrative systems were formalized. The official narrative describes this as recovery, a rebuilding effort following climatic and economic disruption. But the infrastructure built during this period wasn't repair. It was new construction at a scale that exceeded pre-1816 levels. The question isn't whether infrastructure was built, it's why it was built the way it was. The term Tartaria, in its modern usage, functions as a conceptual label, not a claim about a specific empire, but a framework for examining architectural and institutional patterns that standard historical narratives don't fully address. It represents the observation that infrastructure attributed to the 19th century feels older than its records suggest. The evidence doesn't demand a single conclusion. It invites examination. The hospitals, the canals, the grids, the synchronized records, they exist. Their scale, their timing, and their uniformity remain documented in public archives. What they represent depends on how you interpret the gap between the infrastructure and the explanations. Whether that gap reflects inheritance, convergence, or coordination is a question that the physical evidence alone can't answer. But the evidence is there, and it's waiting.